want to try and get to heaven if possible. I'm hearing I'm not doing well.
Well, hello. The guy.
Welcome to the Young Turks. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian. I know I don't host on Fridays often. I was pressured to do so for today. And so I'm gonna do the show I wanna do. And so joining us today, we've got incredible guests. It's gonna be a foreign policy heavy show. And I think it's important to focus on foreign policy for a number of different reasons that will become clear throughout the next 2 hours. Joining us for the first hour is Dave Smith, comedian, foreign policy aficionado, and the host of Part of the Problem, a wonderful show, you should check it out. And we also have Scott Horton, who is the director of the Libertarian Institute, and someone you may have seen absolutely crushing war hawks on various shows online, including his own, by the way, The Scott Horton Show. He's also the author of several incredible books, including Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
What's up, Anna? Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. It's so wonderful to have you two together to do some of these stories with us. And Scott, I just wanted to note that I became politicized in the lead up to Iraq War II. In 2002, when it was really starting to become clear that we were gonna do a preemptive war in Iraq. I remember being in high school, in English class, reading a New York Times article that was quoting Bill Kristol. And I hadn't seen your incredible debate with Bill Kristol, which I think was about 2 years ago. That was an amazing debate, and I feel like you had the same experience with Kristol that I had. I debated him on something entirely different. He was ill-prepared, had no idea what he was talking about, so it was amazing. So good job with that debate. Everyone should check that out.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I went in there on a mission to whoop him and get a little bit of revenge for Ron Paul and the rest of my friends. All of us libertarians have owed Bill Kristol one for a while now, but then he kind of took the wind out of my sail by just being so absolutely horrible on his own that I didn't even really need to show up for the thing. He destroyed himself anyway.
He really did. I mean, the lack of preparedness was incredible. Well, anyway, I wanted to get started with a story about what I feel is just American belligerence when it comes to foreign policy. A lot of different things are developing simultaneously. And if you thought that Donald Trump would really represent an anti-war administration, it's really not shaping up to be that. So without further ado, let's get to the details.
Mr. Secretary, what legal authority did the Pentagon invoke to strike that boat full of drug smugglers?
We have the absolute and complete authority to conduct that. First of all, just the defense of the American people alone. 100,000 Americans were killed each year under the previous administration because of an open border and open drug traffic flow. That is an assault on the American people. I said we smoked a drug boat, and there's 11 narco terrorists at the bottom of the ocean. And when other people try to do that, they're going to meet the same fate.
Not a good sign. Members of the Trump administration, including Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, are struggling to explain what authority they had to blow up an alleged cartel boat leaving Venezuela, which killed 11 people. Now, the boat was allegedly carrying Tren de Aragua drug traffickers, which Trump has designated as a terrorist organization. Normally, the US Coast Guard would intercept suspected drug traffickers in international waters. Also worrying is the fact that our government hasn't even bothered to identify any specific targets. So all of this begs the question, was the US strike on that boat legal? Reuters reports that the United States can argue it was taking anticipatory self-defense action, and Trump said Tren de Aragua was under the control of Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro. However, that falls short of international law without evidence of an imminent attack or past attacks by Tren de Aragua, according to legal experts. Now, the administration has not provided any evidence that the US was in fact in imminent danger or that the vessel was even armed. Plus, our own laws here in the US indicate that drug trafficking is not punishable by death. And it appears that the administration is well aware that they acted outside the parameters of the rule of law that they purport to care so much about, at least when it comes to democratically run liberal cities. In fact, the New York Times had this incredibly fascinating sentence in one of their reports recently having to do with the strike. They wrote that Pentagon officials were still working Wednesday on what legal authority they would tell the public was used to back up the extraordinary strike in international waters. Nonetheless, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a known war hawk who inspired groans from the America First faction on the right when Trump nominated him for Secretary of State, continues his saber rattling.
We destroyed a drug boat that left Venezuela, operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization, which is what these are. And he's been clear that the days of acting with impunity and having an engine shot down or a couple drugs grabbed off a boat, those days are over. Now we are going to wage combat against drug cartels that are flooding American streets and killing Americans.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has responded to the airstrike using an interesting tactic. In recent comments, he decided to blame the escalation almost entirely on Marco Rubio and tried to appeal to Trump's anti-war rhetoric.
Mr. President Donald Trump, you must be careful because Marco Rubio wants to stain your hands with blood. South American, Caribbean, Venezuelan blood. They want to drag you into a bloodbath, to tarnish the Trump name forever with a massacre against the Venezuelan people, with a terrible war across South America and the Caribbean. This would be a full-scale continental war.
But there are other signs of escalation. The US has significantly ramped up its military presence in the Southern Caribbean in recent months. The amphibious ready group and roughly 2,200 Marines from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit are operating near Puerto Rico in the Northern Caribbean Sea. They're joined by 2 guided missile destroyers and a cruiser, which are also operating in the Caribbean. And I mean, let's keep it real. Marines are usually deployed for boots on the ground, not a great sign here. And just today, the Pentagon announced that it's sending 10 F-35 fighter jets to the Caribbean to be used in operations allegedly targeting drug cartels. And I say allegedly because honestly, I personally don't believe this is about drugs for a single second. And Dave, you recently had Dave DeCamp on from antiwar.com, and he mentioned something that even I didn't know about in regard to the Trump administration blowing boats up. Let's take a look.
I mean, the US military just blew a boat out of the water in the Caribbean, claiming that it was carrying drugs. And actually, they did something similar in Somalia a few months ago. They bombed a boat and claimed it was smuggling weapons. And I remember thinking, like, how could you know that? How could you know everybody on the boat is even aware that they're smuggling weapons? Like, how could you really know that? And they're probably just relying on like whoever their allies are, whatever they tell them about that boat. And now we see it. I mean, this is a precedent has been set now. If you want to get into this, by this US, I believe it was an airstrike. It hasn't been confirmed, maybe a drone or something. The US bombing a boat, claiming that it's carrying drugs and killing, according to President Trump, 11 people, which he calls terrorists.
Okay, so what the hell is going on here? And how many conflicts is the United States involved in that most Americans don't even know about? So I opened it up to you, Dave Smith. I want to know, what your thoughts are about what's really going on with Venezuela.
Well, I like that you played that clip of Dave DeCamp, which I should give a shout out to him. He's the man, and he's really Scott's absolute best guy over there at antiwar.com. And I read him every single day. And if you really want to stay informed, read Dave DeCamp.
Absolutely.
At antiwar.com, because he's He's all over like every conflict and puts out like multiple articles every day about it. Yeah, it's kind of like the war on drugs times the war on terrorism, and they've both been such successful policies that why don't we merge these two things? And for some reason, this seems to be like catnip to a lot of the Trump supporters, that they just, all right, we're narco terrorists is all you need to hear for right wingers, I guess, to get excited, or at least some of them. And of course, what does that even mean exactly? Like, can we define that term? Can you demonstrate? In this case, we haven't demonstrated that they were drug dealers or that they were terrorists. Like, what act of terrorism are you accusing them of committing? And of course, this policy is just, you can see it's Trump just flirting with another disastrous idea. We'll see how far he ends up going with it. But when Pete Hegseth is mentioning that 100,000 people die of overdoses every year, what he's leaving out is that that's after 50 years of the war on drugs. Like, this is the result of this big government tyrannical policy of regulating what Americans can put in their bodies after all of these years, and filling up so many prisons with drug offenders and drug dealers. This is where we are now. And as Dave DeCamp also pointed out when I was interviewing him the other day, when you're talking about, say, drone bombing, narco terrorists, well, can anyone point to one example where that's worked in the war on terrorism? Like, in any one of these theaters, where is that? It was in Afghanistan in 2009 when General McChrystal came up with the insurgent math, that term. And basically just being like, we're creating more and more terrorists with all of these every time we take people off of our list. Of course, as Scott has covered in his phenomenal book Enough Already, in Yemen before the Saudi invasion, when Obama was fighting Al-Qaeda there, from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula from 2009 to 2015. He was drone bombing them, and their numbers kept growing and growing and growing. And the same was true in Syria and Iraq. And so I guess we want to bring all of that success right into our hemisphere now. And as Dave DeCamp also pointed out, and I'll kick it over to Scott after this, but if you really were even concerned about the drug trade, it's not as if Venezuela is the main problem. It's much more stuff comes through Colombia and Mexico. And so it just happens to be the regime change that Marco Rubio has had a hard on for many years, happens to be the target of narco terrorism. I don't know. I'm gonna need to see some evidence. I'm not buying any of it.
Well, to your point, and I'm gonna kick it over to you, Scott, in Trump's first term, for all of the, celebrations that you'll see from the America First crowd in regard to Trump's so-called isolationism, in reality, in his first term, he did attempt to topple the regime in Venezuela, I believe twice, and essentially install Juan Guaido as like some, puppet leader for the United States. So am I wrong to think that the drug war is really a cover story here for what is really gonna be a regime change war with Venezuela?
Well, yeah, that's certainly my concern as well. And by the way, it was on the very bad advice of Marco Rubio back then to do that. And when, of course, Juan Guaido had no real charisma whatsoever, much less a real base of support in the country to support him. It's a very small faction. And then he called for military intervention on his own behalf, which of course is treason and the death knell of any domestic popularity he ever could have, and is, I believe, widely regarded as a joke now. So I don't know who they have in mind to do it, but I think you're right that this very well could be a pretext for that. As far as the war on drugs itself here and fighting it in this way, Senator Rand Paul came out today and said this is illegal, and the law says you just interdict these guys. If they have drugs, you prosecute them. But this is America. We should presume whoever's on that boat, who we know from that bird's eye view, from that drone's eye view, they don't really know who those people are. They should be presumed innocent. We're not at war with Venezuela. That's a criminal matter. They should be arrested and, if necessary, prosecuted. But as Dave said, all of that is essentially an endless jobs program for a bunch of DEA agents anyway, who never accomplish anything.
That's exactly, yeah, that's right. But why would Trump want to do a regime change war in Venezuela? Like, what are the motivations, the possible motivations here?
Well, they have a lot of oil and they've maintained their independence from us. And of course, they've been essentially a leftist regime, to the left. By leftist, I mean to the left of progressive, since Hugo Chavez. And Maduro has, made himself no friend of the United States. And so they have a full sanctions regime on them. People complain for good reasons about Venezuelan gangs in this country, but America's international sanctions regime has done as much to destroy Venezuela as their, pseudo-Marxoid economy that they've had, because, any national government can still hire some French company to come in and run their oil company for them or whatever like that, but they're not allowed to. The sanctions regime prevents that. So America is, I don't know what percentage, but roughly half the reason Venezuela is as poor as it is, and why they have such crime and so many refugees and economic refugees and others emigrating from there in the first place. So,
yeah,
force is very tempting, and especially Donald Trump is the kind of guy who, if his people tell him, look, the solution to this is just make it go bang, then he's listening at least. You know what I mean? Especially when it seems like, kind of high benefit, low cost. Like, what's the worst that could happen if he attacks Venezuela? It's not like picking a fight over in Mesopotamia or something. So you could see how for him, like Bush Sr. in Panama, this is one that we could do and get away with probably without too much trouble, maybe. I'm not saying that's true, but I could see that being their thinking.
But my concern is that we're getting mixed up. Well, we're making a lot of different enemies all across the globe right now. So in regard to the interview that you had, Dave, with DeCamp, he talked a lot about what's currently transpiring in Somalia and how the airstrikes, the US airstrikes in Somalia have really ramped up under the second Trump administration. Most Americans don't know about that. We're doing what we're doing right now with Venezuela. We are aiding and abetting a genocide in Gaza and the annexation of the West Bank in the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot going on. And so it's very easy to kind of get caught up in this ideology of, well, we're this military superpower and no one's gonna attack us and no harm will come to the United States. But we also know that the way wars are fought has really changed. And with the emergence of drones, I think that really does change the game in regard to US security. I'm a little bit concerned about what's going on right now and whether our foreign policy is actually attracting a lot more hostility that could put Americans at risk. What do you think about that, Dave?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's a real concern, and of course, this is what created the terrorist problem to begin with. I think what we've done here now, being completely implicated for facilitating the genocide in Gaza, all these military campaigns where there really is no clear threat to US national security, but the hatred that we engender from these campaigns is a real threat to US national security. And I do think, I get caught up a little bit, obviously the war hawks are always trying to make people scared. And this, back, if you could remember Dick Cheney after 9/11, talking about it's not a matter of if, but when. And so they're always playing up this, you have to be afraid and therefore give all of your, give us additional power and kind of turn your brain off. But the policy of immediately after the terror wars, having the Joe Biden de facto open borders, and now just getting right back into the game of wars of choice, and of course backing Israel's just horrific genocide of the Gazans. It does just seem like, this policy is just so insane. And yeah, I'm very concerned about potential blowback terrorism from all of these conflicts. So yeah, who knows? I know Scott said the other day, I interviewed Scott on my show about a week and a half ago, and even Scott was saying, as upset as some of us are with Tulsi Gabbard and the way she handled both the bombing of the Houthis and the bombing of Iran, Scott was saying, man, I hope she really is focused on bin Ladenite radicals every day, because this is a real threat that we should be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. And It's interesting because there's this cover story when it comes to what's happening with Venezuela. The US is also, along with Israel, kind of threatening the government of Lebanon. You need to disarm Hezbollah, or else there could be some military action taken against you. You also have, I don't think the Iran conflict is over by any means. And of course, there's still pressure from Israel for the US to go back in. But there's also like this other side of the Trump administration, or Trump himself, where he's actually very honest. So I actually want to pivot to what has just happened with a new executive order, because Donald Trump is expected to sign an executive order today, which would, in my opinion, accurately rebrand the Defense Department as the Department of War. Because it does seem like the Defense Department does a lot less defending and a lot more warring. So according to a document describing the EO, restoring the name Department of War will sharpen the focus of this department on our national interest. I don't know if it's really in our national interest to start wars, but nonetheless, and signal to adversaries America's readiness to wage war to secure its interests. I think that the international community is well aware that we're willing to wage war pretty much over anything, but there are suspicions that this all stemmed from a single passing comment that Trump made to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Hegseth has been discussing the issue internally since March, said a person familiar with the matter, apparently inspired after a White House meeting at which Trump quipped, "You look more like a Secretary of War." In August, Trump also said, defense is too defensive, and we want to be defensive, but we want to be offensive too if we have to be. He has argued that defense was too politically correct a term. It's too woke, I guess, and that War Department just sounded better. So Scott, thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, there's some truth in what he's saying, that this always was a politically correct term for it, right? They renamed it the Department of Defense in 1947 after they passed the National Security Act and really made it the Department of World Empire, right? And the Department of Aggression. Before that, they were at least honest enough to call it what it was. So as far as dumping the euphemism and getting back to calling things by their proper names, I'm all for it. In the spirit of George Carlin and the originators of this language, we deserve that. But if the whole point is to reinvigorate that martial spirit, well, yeah, no, we've had enough of that. America first doesn't mean be George W. Bush, the idiot, selfish jerk who goes around calling things America's national interest and then doing them. It means defend America first. It means we're not the world's policemen. Leave the rest of the world the hell alone with their own problems and to solve them too in their own way. Makes no sense. A middle part of North America has got to be the world empire forever. We clearly just cannot afford it anyway, even if we had the mandate of heaven to do it, which we don't. So.
Well, luckily there is a growing group of conservatives in America, conservative voters who are speaking up more and more about how they don't want to intervene and get involved in foreign conflicts. And when we come back from the break, we're gonna get into that. We're gonna talk a little bit about this growing rift and what transpired over at the National Conservatism Conference. So stick around for that and more. We'll be right back. everyone, welcome back to our first social break of the day. I'm glad you guys are loving the show based on what I'm reading in the comments. So don't shoot, I'm the goalkeeper brings up an interesting point, a point that I agree with actually. Does this administration really think another 9/11 can't happen? If someone wanted to attack us, I don't think this regime would catch it before it happens. They can't even catch school shooters before they shoot up their schools. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I brought up in that segment. I mean, I'm worried about the US. You know, there's a lot of fear mongering about like, oh, these isolationist policies. Isolationism would be better than just starting wars and creating more enemies across the globe, whether we're talking about Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. And this is all, by the way, happening while the US purports to want to really compete with China, which is growing in influence, growing in power. They're investing quite a bit in their military. And we do live in a multipolar world right now. The US is no longer, the sole superpower on the globe. And so these are all things to take into consideration. I feel that our foreign policy here in the United States is tripling down on the type of foreign policy that will not bode well for us, even as we try to compete on the international stage. And it's also not a good sign that through some of the policies that Trump has been championing in his second term, he's pushing some allies away. The fact that India's hanging out with a longtime foe, China, and celebrating as China is putting on this military parade is not a good look for the United States and not a good development for the United States. And in the meantime, China, as I've talked about on the show, is really flexing soft power by focusing on mutually beneficial infrastructure projects in Africa. So these are all things to take into consideration. Everything is connected. Let's move on to, I want to read a few super chats. Here we go. We got Stinky Feet who says, currently, I just assume 90% of what Trump does is to distract from the Epstein files. So no, it probably wasn't legal, but he won't be held accountable. Well, the fact that there was already a boat that was bombed by the Trump administration and no one even knew about it. Well, obviously some reporters knew about it. Dave DeCamp knew about it and reported on it. But the fact that, it wasn't really talked about in our mainstream media, it wasn't reported about, certainly in legacy media outlets is concerning because it does set a precedent, and I do think it's a dangerous precedent. And I just think, any notion of international law has totally been dismantled as a result of US foreign policy. Bach says, I like the idea of the Department of War. It makes dumping taxes on it less popular. That's an interesting thought. Let's see if that actually happens. But really at this point, I think you need, to build coalitions of anti-war individuals, Americans, whether they're on the left or the right, it doesn't matter. We need to ensure that our foreign policy works to the benefit of the American people. Let's get back to the show. Welcome back to the show. Anna Kasparian, Scott Horton, and Dave Smith with you. I wanted to talk a little bit about this growing trend on the right. And it's real, it's not fake. There are more and more voices on the right who don't want to intervene in foreign conflicts. They don't want to aid and abet genocides. And they certainly don't want to engage in regime change wars. But they are up against the traditional right, if the interventional, those who want to intervene, and that was really on full display during the National Conservatism Conference. Take a look.
Why are these our wars? Why are Israel's endless problems America's liabilities? Why are we in the National Conservative Bloc, broadly speaking, why do we laugh out of the room this argument when it's advanced by Volodymyr Zelensky, but are slavish hypocrites for Benjamin Netanyahu? Why should we accept America first, asterisk Israel? And the answer is we shouldn't.
The conservative divide over what it means to be America First was on full display this week at the annual National Conservatism Conference. And the guy that you just watched is named Kurt Mills. He's the editor and executive director of the American Conservative, who went up against interventionist Max Abrams, an assistant professor of political science at Northeastern University. Now, the two butted heads over America's unconditional support for Israel and Donald Trump's decision to drag the United States even deeper into Middle East conflicts. Now, here's how Kelly Vlalos, who is over at Responsible Statecraft, summed up the debate. Abrams came out swinging to call all realists today, by the way, I personally identify as a realist, but all realists today, especially John Mearsheimer, wrong on the issue of Iran and the Middle East writ large. In fact, he called them all MAGA isolationist realists who have become insane in their wrong-headed analysis since being right on the failures of the post 9/11 wars. Now, Abrams also referred to Trump's bombing of Iran as successful and argued that the isolationists said any American intervention in Iran would be just like the Iraq War. They said that Trump and DNI Tulsi Gabbard were lying or at the very least totally wrong about Iran's nuclear weapons capability, that the US had no strategic interest in Iran, that Trump is some kind of a weak snowflake who can't ever stand up to Israel, that he'll only intervene due to Israeli pressure against his own volition, and that Israel may well deliberately kill Americans all over the Persian Gulf in a series of false flag operations. Now, this is some really insane stuff. This is some really crazy stuff. It's probably the most inaccurate Mideast punditry that you can find anywhere. Now, Abrams also accused his anti-interventionist foes of being paid mouthpieces for George Soros and the Kochs. And honestly, I think that's a pretty ridiculous thing to say when you know what's happened with USS Liberty or with the Beirut bombing in 1983. In fact, Scott Horton briefly weighed in on what Mossad likely knew before the Beirut bombing even happened. This was on Piers Morgan's show.
In Victor Ostrovsky's book, By Way of Deception, he says that the Mossad knew that Hezbollah, or I guess proto-Hezbollah at that time, was making a giant truck bomb and decided explicitly not to warn the Americans before the Beirut attack that killed 241 American Marines in 1983. I have to wonder if that's why Ronald Reagan went ahead and pulled out at that time instead of doubling down. It's because he knew of their treachery. That's again in the book By Way of Deception. And it just goes to highlight the vast daylight and discrepancy between the interests of the nation state of Israel, which, as the gentleman said, of course, they're a very small nation state. It's in their interest, obviously, to get America to do what they want.
So, Scott, I did not know about what you had revealed on Piers Morgan's show at all. And I want to just kind of pause and have you elaborate on that a little more, because I think that Americans, maybe it's because of the kind of public school education we received. Our textbooks were published by Robert Maxwell, who was the head of two publishing houses here, Macmillan and McGraw-Hill. Those two publishing houses published the textbooks that our students read in public schools. So these types of, what you revealed is not something that the typical American ever hears about. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I really should try to interview this guy. I think he's still around. He's a former Mossad spy, last I heard living in exile in Canada. And he wrote this book By Way of Deception, which that's the slogan of the Israeli Mossad, By Way of Deception, thou shalt do war. And which I don't know what the origin of that is, but anyway, that's their slogan, that's the book. And he says in there that they knew, as I said in that clip there, they knew that this group of Shiite fighters were making a truck bomb, and they knew that there was only one or two targets available. There were only one or two targets that were the potential targets for this thing. There had already been a couple of truck bombs back and forth at that point. And then so it was brought up, well, we better tell the Americans. And he has quotes, which it's a single source, but his quotes are that they said, well, that's what they get for sticking their nose into our business. And I forget the other one was, I forget. I don't want to say what the second one was because I forget, but that was what they get. That's what they get for sticking their noses in, was one of them. And there was a second quote too, being dismissive. It may have been just the Americans. It's up to them to take care of themselves. We don't owe them anything, something like that.
So if
and then
real quick,
they said that to this day. This is why we have to hate the Shiites and the Iranians to this day, is because of that bombing in 1983. Even if Ronald Reagan sold them missiles a year and a half after that,
That's incredible. And just for anyone who doesn't know the context, so we had a US peacekeeping mission, and the whole point was to just kind of prevent an ongoing war with the Israelis. And I guess that's what Israel was salty about. And they didn't tell us that our soldiers, that hundreds of Americans were under threat from a potential Hezbollah bombing in Beirut.
Yeah. Wow. Look, the reality is that it's clear that the leadership in Israel, past and present, and probably future, that they don't care about the American people any more than they care about the Palestinians, right? We're all just grasshoppers to them. And so they got to sink our Navy ship or try to. If they gotta, refuse to share all that they know about the hijackers hiding in Florida, or if they gotta, keep it under their hat that there's about to be a truck bombing against our Marines in Beirut or whatever it is, if it's in their interest in the short term. And this is actually always very surprising to me, in fact, because you could obviously argue that this is not in their interest to treat the American people like, we're absolutely just cattle, on their ranch. What if we start to resent that and refuse to pay their way and fight their wars anymore? So you can see why things like this might be in their interest in the short term, but then they do things that end up leading to a lot of resentment against them, and which from their point of view, you would think would jeopardize their interest for the medium and the long term. But, politicians tend to think in very short cycles, I guess.
Yeah, well, I want to get back to the conference and the response to all of these allegations, toward the isolationists. Because, look, what about Mills? Okay, how did he respond? Well, according to the reporting, Mills quickly pointed out that there was a deal with Iran on the table, and Trump could have achieved much more and without bloodshed if he had let the negotiations go on and had not gotten sucked into the vortex of Israel and its supporters in Washington who so desperately wanted to bomb Iran. And here's a little gem from Mills on the power Israel has exerted over the United States.
Why have I become a hater and utterly convinced that the US-Israel relationship, particularly when Republicans hold national power, has become a world historical, perhaps the world historical case of the tail wagging the dog? As former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, as mentioned by Max, a longtime source of mine, as well as that of most fun journalists in this town, has taken to labeling the dynamic, Israel is a vassal state calling the shots in the world's most powerful empire, and regime change in Tel Aviv, his words, not mine, is necessary.
Finally, Mills chided the Trump administration's crackdown on critics of Israel's genocide under the guise of preventing anti-Semitism, saying one could be forgiven for believing the only people this administration is reliably deporting are supporters of the Palestinian cause, after riding back into power on the appeal of free speech enshrined in the First Amendment of this country's constitution. If conserving that isn't conservatism, I don't know what is. This administration has used its influence to attempt to curb and intimidate speech on Middle East issues, particularly the State Department. After assembling and potentially generationally realigning a cohort of voters disgusted with woke pieties and suffocation of dialogue with incessant accusations of racism, Republicans have all too eagerly embraced holding the whip themselves, accusing countless critics as anti-Semites instead of engaging on the issue. And what makes this particular debate even more interesting is NatCon, which hosted the event, of course, was launched back in 2019 by a guy named Yoram Hazani, a staunch pro-Israel nationalist. Historically, this event has avoided foreign policy discussions, but this year there were luckily 2 sessions featuring anti-war voices. As for the reception, well, Kelly Vlalos reports that the questions from the audience were 90% sympathetic to Mills, but that there was some audible support when Abrams said that Palestine cannot be given a state. And even though we're hearing from more and more anti-war voices on the right, and that's a good thing, unfortunately, it does appear that most Republicans are still in Israel's corner when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. So take a look at this chart. It shows that a July Gallup poll found 71% of Republicans say they approve of Israel's action in Gaza. And I'm curious about that, Dave, because honestly, I've been hearing from so many high-profile people on the right who identify as right-wingers, who are pushing back against, the Trump administration's foreign policy. I don't know if that polling's accurate, but I am curious what your feel of the situation is.
Well, I think there's no question that something major is happening on the grassroots level of the right wing in America, and this is a good example of it. I was at a Turning Point USA event a couple months back, and I did a debate there moderated by Charlie Kirk, and it was certainly a divided crowd. But I mean, like twice as much of the portion of the crowd that agreed with me was twice as big as the one that disagreed with me. And I know Charlie Kirk put out a poll after that, and I won the poll. And this is Charlie Kirk's event, like of all places you would think would be a pro-Israel space. And I certainly have seen a lot of polling with the young people, young right-wingers. There's been a massive shift in terms of supporting Israel. And I think a lot of it is like even like Max Abrams' points are just all so ridiculous. And he can try to point to like, oh, okay, there's some conspiracy theorists who think Israel might launch a false flag or something. But the bottom line, it's funny, you brought up Scott's debate with Bill Kristol from a few years back. And one of my favorite parts of that debate is at one point someone in the audience asks a question to Bill Kristol and says, what's the last US intervention that worked out well? Like, which one is the last one that you can defend? And Bill Kristol, son of Irving Kristol, arch neocon, super genius, I think he said the Baltics. Was that right, Scott? Was that the one he
said Bosnia, 95.
Oh, Bosnia. I'm sorry, it was Bosnia. Yeah. So in other words, even Bill Kristol couldn't even begin to attempt to defend Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Syria or Somalia or Yemen or any of these. And so you can call us isolationists all you want, whatever that means. Like we're arguing, don't fight another stupid war of choice, of aggression. That makes you an isolationist. Meanwhile, what's going on? China's having military parades with Kim Jong-un and the leaders from India and Vladimir Putin and all of them. It seems like the policies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Donald Trump have been doing a lot to isolate America. Like,
good
since
point.
When is like dropping bombs on innocent people is what? Bringing us all together? What is that, unifying us? And yet we're the ones that people like me and Scott who are like, hey, just be friends and trade with everybody. Somehow we're cast as the isolationists. The bottom line is that every last one of these wars, and including the war in Ukraine, including the war in, or not, the genocide in Gaza, all of them are just sold off lies and perpetuated off of lies. I mean, we heard for years through all of these things, it's like all the years that they said, we're really building up this Afghan army that's gonna hold the country after we're gone. And we were supposed to recover all Ukrainian territory according to Biden and Nancy Pelosi and all of these things. It's just, and so all that's happening, Anna, as you know well, is that the control of the corporate media has been destroyed. And now people aren't being propagandized in the same way. And so they're seeing through things. Like nobody has a good response to the stuff that Kurt Mills was saying there. And so all they could do is call you an anti-Semite or, I don't know, maybe they jump on the worst excesses of some conspiracies. And yeah, people get into kooky stuff sometimes on Twitter or whatever, but none of that is really getting at the point, which is that they had control of American foreign policy for many decades. They've completely blown it. They've bankrupted the country and just left millions of corpses of innocent people in the trail to show for it. So people are rejecting that. It really is that simple.
Yeah, and what I'm worried about is, as this anti-war sentiment within the United States grows, I'm seeing more of an effort to engage in censorship, engage in labeling people terrorists in order to punish them for speaking out against the support that we're providing for a genocide in Gaza. And so when we come back from the break, I actually want to delve into that a little more because some pretty scary things are happening, not just in the United States, but particularly in Europe, in the UK, when it comes to silencing, peace protesters, peace demonstrators. I want to get everyone's thoughts on that when we return, so stick around. Miss Frilly Knickers writes in our members section and says, Scott used to be a skateboarding buddy. So Scott, you have someone who knows you through other means watching the show today, so.
What was the name?
It's her handle, Miss Frilly Knickers. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I've known some great lady skateboarders in my time.
That's awesome, I love that.
Long time.
Wolf Lampert, who's been a member for 12 months, says they won't stay divided forever. There will be culture war to bring them back together. So there's, I am worried about that because anytime there is this blurring of partisan lines and you see ordinary Americans, opening their minds up to someone on the other side of the political aisle, wanting to work together for like a common goal, I do feel like politicians throw red meat at us and then people just start fighting each other again and kind of lose sight of what's important. I hope that doesn't happen, but I think you're touching on something that's been used as a tactic by people in power for a long time. Disrupt Daily says, I'm so tired of him playing war with our military and tax dollars. Yeah, I'm tired of our federal government doing that, regardless of who's in charge, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. It's incredibly frustrating. Lady AF gifted 10 memberships, thank you, and Box gifted 1, and welcome to our new member, Ya. Let's move over to super chats. Grizz, my homie from the street, says, this power panel represents my political ideology better than any other people. TYT, Dave Smith, and Scott Horton, a left-leaning libertarian. I don't know if you're a left-leaning libertarian, are you, Scott?
No, I don't think so. I'm a kind of Ron Paul type. I mean, I'm a skater from Austin, so I'm not really a right winger, but I'm just kind of a plumb line libertarian, I think.
I just, honestly, right now.
I'm kind of a right wing crank on some things, but.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you mean. And honestly, right now, I don't really think the partisan lines hold much. I think things are kind of getting blurred, and that's in a lot of ways a good thing.
And I've always been a libertarian. I've never been a conservative or a liberal who then converted later or anything like that. I've been like this since high school, so.
Interesting.
But I think we need to all be for hard money and guns and property rights and freedom and anti-war. Those things ought to be universal American principles, no matter really where you're at. That's where everybody can agree with libertarians like me.
All right, let's go to Robert. Thank you for the super chat. Same to Ben, and Brenda Jones writes in and says, of course it would be the Department of War. Israel wouldn't have it any other way. But again, like we said in that segment, I think it's more honest to call it Department of War because that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it does. All right, we've got 30 seconds. Let me read a few.
Think about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just real quick, Anna. Since 1947, the Defense Department never fought a defensive war. Not one.
That's true. That's true. It's crazy. It really is. The amount of money and resources we pour into conflicts abroad and, starting wars is just out of control. All right, we got to get back to the show. All right, welcome back to the show, everyone. Anna Kasparian, Dave Smith, and Scott Horton with you. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of freedom of expression, something that I do feel is under threat, not just here in the United States, but certainly in Europe as well, certainly in the UK. Let's get into it.
I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential.
Vice President J.D. Vance received quite a bit of backlash for his allegations that free speech is under threat in Europe. That was at the Munich Security Conference. But in reality, there is some truth to what he was saying, and he is right. There are many examples that we're about to get into. But what's ironic is that months after giving that very speech at the Munich Security Conference, the Trump administration began engaging in arrests, attempted deportations, and sanctioning pro-Palestinian groups that are critical of Israel's genocidal acts and fight to ensure Palestinian civilians get a modicum of justice. So we'll get to the latest examples of that in just a moment, but it is worth noting that some pretty wild things are going down in the United Kingdom. In fact, 7 people have been charged with terrorism over Zoom meetings. More specifically, the alleged offenses relate to a group called Defend Our Juries, arranging public protests in support of Palestine Action in London, Manchester, and Cardiff, as well as a demonstration planned for this Saturday in London. The charges also cover 13 Zoom meetings allegedly held between July and August in support of the prescribed group. Oh my God, Zoom meetings, crazy. Now, the 7 people who were charged are all members of Defend Our Juries. Defend Our Juries is a UK activist organization linked to Palestine Action. It criticized the arrests and said they would not deter people from taking part in this weekend's protest. So why are officials in the UK up in arms about Palestine Action? And how are they justifying the label of terrorist when it comes to peace activists? Well, the UK-based Palestine Action, which aims to disrupt the operations of weapons manufacturers supplying the Israeli government, was proscribed in July, a month after 2 of its activists broke into Britain's largest airbase and damaged 2 military aircraft. It's a ballsy thing to do. So the group's ban makes it illegal under UK law to be a member of or even invite support for Palestine Action. The terrorist designation also puts them on par with organizations such as Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. I should note that the US armed Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria to topple Bashar al-Assad. But anyway, let me move on. 6 people aged between 26 and 62 were charged on Wednesday as part of an investigation led by Counterterrorism Command of London's Metropolitan Police. A 7th person was charged on Tuesday in a connected investigation by police in Scotland. And just to see how ridiculous this all appears to be, like take a look at one of the people who got arrested, take a look at what that scene looked like, and just how scary and threatening this guy looks.
Just watch your response. So yeah, this is what happens. Britain in 2025.
Right, can we have a hand?
Opposing genocide.
But I'm going to be placing you under arrest, okay? And I'm going to read out the reason for that. The time now is 7:10 in the morning. It's the 2nd of September. So, Patrick, you are under arrest on suspicion of committing the offence of Section 12, subsection 3 of the Terrorism Act 2000. You are alleged to have addressed an online Zoom meeting between the 10th of July 2025 and the 21st of August 2025 for the purpose of encouraging support and furthering the activities of prescribed organisation Palestine Action. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention or question something which you later write in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. So the arrest is necessary to prevent loss of evidence, prevent collusion with co-suspects, and to allow for searches under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act and to facilitate his interview.
Hundreds of people have been arrested in the United Kingdom over their participation in pro-Palestine demonstrations. More than 700 people have been arrested and 114 charged by the Metropolitan Police in connection with this summer's demonstrations, with over 500 people arrested during a singular demonstration in August alone. But things are getting pretty bad in the United States as well. Marco Rubio posted on X yesterday that this is the latest example. Today, the Trump administration is sanctioning 3 NGOs, Al-Haq, Al-Mezan, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, for assisting in the ICC's illegitimate actions against Israel. The United States will continue to protect our own sovereignty and the sovereignty of our allies from the ICC's overreach. That's insane. So the overreach that he's referring to is the prosecution of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel, of course, who is a war criminal that is guilty of carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Last year, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on charges of crimes against humanity and other war crimes. So those warrants came as a result of the 3 groups now being sanctioned, asking the ICC to investigate Israel's airstrikes in Gaza in 2023. But the US State Department made clear that they're in bed with Israel regardless of how loathsome their war crimes are. In a statement, the State Department claimed that the ICC has a politicized agenda and declared that the ongoing actions of the ICC set a dangerous precedent for all nations. But that's not all. In February, the US moved to prohibit Karim Khan, the ICC's chief prosecutor, from entering the country or doing business with the US. And in June, it sanctioned 4 International Criminal Court judges involved in the probe. The following month, the State Department announced sanctions against a top UN Human Rights Council official who has called on the ICC to prosecute companies and corporate executives tied to the Israeli government. Al-Haq has responded by calling the sanctions a heinous and draconian measure that constitute a cowardly, immoral, illegal, and undemocratic act. The group also wrote, as the world moves to impose sanctions and arms embargoes on Israel, its ally, the United States, is working to destroy Palestinian institutions, working tirelessly for accountability for the victims of Israel's mass atrocity crimes. I'm just gonna pause and note that reporting using internal IDF data indicates that at least, this is the IDF's own data, at least 83% of people killed in Gaza by the IDF happen to be civilians. These are obviously war crimes. And just last week, the State Department also announced sanctions against the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization ahead of the UN General Assembly in New York, which could prevent PA leaders from traveling to America for the meeting. This is all happening with the backdrop of student visa or green card holders becoming targets for arrest and deportation if they participate in pro-peace protests or write op-eds for their school paper, by the way, critical of Israel's actual war crimes in war crimes in their student papers. So this is really concerning because I think that you're onto something, Dave, when you talk about how the paradigm shift is clear. Corporate media has lost power, legacy media has lost power. There's this explosion of independent sources that are informing the American public about the reality of our foreign policy and how detrimental it is to the American people and to others abroad, by the way. And so I'm worried that now our government might move to engage in unconstitutional acts against our freedom of expression. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's like when they say when a woman leaves an abusive husband, that's the most dangerous time. Like right. That's when the guy might flip out and actually kill her. And that doesn't mean it's like the correct move is still for her to leave that guy, but it's also the most dangerous time. And so there is a concern where, as their kind of ability to control the narrative through their more traditional means, which they always had, they didn't really need to resort to these type of tactics for a while because they could say just get Donahue fired from MSNBC or get, you know what I mean? Like they would just, if somebody was against the war in Iraq or was getting a little bit too close to it, they would just kind of get rid of that. person. And me and Scott's intellectual hero Murray Rothbard was really driven out of kind of polite society in his time and relegated to form his own institutions and stuff like that. But he was like a guy who was writing for National Review and was a founder of the Cato Institute, and then they totally boxed him out. And that's the way the old system used to work for a long time. And that they don't really have that anymore. And so now they're trying to crack down in these other ways. I think the only answer to this is that we got to overwhelm them with numbers, and all of us just have to not budge on this to the point that it's like, well, there's no way they're gonna shut this conversation down anyway. But it is disturbing, it's so many of the people who like defend Israel blindly, like the Bill Maher's of the world or whatever. They always say it's a battle of civilizations, and Israel represents liberalism and Western civilization and democracy and all these things. But then you'd be like, but what does that even mean? If the bedrock principle isn't that you're allowed to say what you want to say, you're allowed to criticize a government policy, especially when that government policy is mass murder. And in some sense, the people who say that about Israel, like there is a kernel of truth to it. I mean, in Israel proper, there is some degree of that liberal tradition of freedom of speech, and that's why Israeli newspapers will tell you about the war crimes that Benjamin Netanyahu is committing every day. And they don't seem to get arrested for it. And even, they had just a couple weeks ago, there were protests in the hundreds of thousands, people protesting the war in Tel Aviv there. And I don't think I heard about anyone there getting arrested or shut down for it. But you see, because we have to support Israel in everything they do, we have to give up our freedom of speech in the Western world, which is just so totally outrageous. But I should say there is a long tradition of this in the United States of America. I mean, it's not as if it's what a lot of, in the mind, I think of a lot of young people, they'll be like, cancel culture is this new phenomenon that just started. But people can go read up on what Woodrow Wilson was doing to anti-war activists during World War I. And these type of tactics are, this is I think probably one of, maybe not the number one reason, like the humanitarian reason might be number one, but certainly one of the top reasons why guys like me and Scott are so anti-war is because war is the health of the state, and it's the biggest indicator of what the relationship between the citizen and the government is. And that it's always true in times of war that governments crack down on civil liberties, and first amongst those is speech. That's anti-war.
In fact, I feel like the trend of labeling anything the federal government doesn't like, or anyone who pushes back against the federal government, certainly when it comes to foreign policy, as terrorists, like really ramped up during the war on terror under the Bush administration. And I remember at that time, shows like the Young Turks, like warning against that, right? Warning against just labeling fellow Americans as terrorist supporters or terrorist sympathizers if they were speaking out against US foreign policy. And it was difficult to do that, by the way, especially in the early years of the Bush administration, because Americans were understandably terrified of what could happen if we didn't engage in this war against terrorism. We had just been victimized in the largest terror attack in American history. But I think that the politics of fear should be something that's top of mind for most Americans, because if the government is trying to scare you, it's usually because they want to engage in some pretty nefarious policies. So I'm gonna let you have the last word on this, Scott. Thoughts on all of this, what's happening in the UK, what's happening in the US, and what the future might hold as more and more people speak out against our unwavering commitment to Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it's another tragic piece of blowback, another side effect of American support for Israel. Another demonstration of our support for that country being against the interests of the American people, regardless of what the people in DC say. But, as previously discussed here, there's a great crack up coming on the left. It's virtually the entire voting population of the Democratic Party versus its rulers. And more it's becoming that way on the right. I saw your poll, but there was a different one recently that had it a 50-50 split as far as Republican sympathies with the Palestinians or the Israelis. So it depends on how you ask the question and all of that. but it's really changing quite rapidly on the right. And as Colonel McGregor says, time wins more arguments than reason. And it just turns out we just had nothing to show for all of our pro-Israel wars in the Middle East and the rest of these policies. And more people are finally just turning against it. America first or Israel instead. You can't have it both ways. So then this is what's really exciting, is we're gonna have a situation where, just like on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, you have the rulers of the party versus more or less the voting population and in its majority on this issue. And it's not gonna be as stark of a difference as it is on the left, quite soon enough for my taste, but it's coming. And then we'll have, just like over there, it'll be apartheid, right? With the small minority ruling the rest, despite the overwhelming consensus of the American people. We don't want any part of this anymore. And then that's untenable for the long term. So the crack up is coming. I encourage everybody to keep pushing.
Well, I credit the two of you for, focusing on foreign policy so heavily and informing people about things that we aren't gonna get in corporate media or legacy media. So everyone, please support the work that Dave and Scott do. As I mentioned earlier, Dave Smith is the host of Part of the Problem. Please subscribe to the show. Is there anything else you'd like to promote before we go, Dave?
Oh, can I just say, you know what? Scott's got this sitting in back of him, but I'm out on the road doing comedy shows, and I'm in a hotel, which is, I got little kids, so this is the only time I get my reading done. But so I've literally just been cracking into this. I'm like halfway done. It is so good, dude. Creative Chaos by William Van Wagenen is just the story of the CIA's covert war in Syria and how Barack Obama and John Brennan started that whole catastrophe. And I've read I'm halfway through this thing in my first sitting. It's so great. It was just published by the Libertarian Institute. So I don't see any money from that, but I just wanted to plug it because it's a really good book.
You're amazing, Dave. I love it so much. I love it so much. And by the way, thank you for doing your best to inform people about how we were attacked by Al-Qaeda, but did arm Al-Qaeda in Syria under the Obama administration. I don't think most people are aware of that. But Scott,
no, it's okay, Anna. You can be friends. You can be friends with them now. Hezbollah was always the enemy of the American people. That's what you got to worry about.
It's just wild. And Scott Horton, again, is the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's written many books. Scott, I want to kick it over to you to promote anything you'd like.
Yeah, well, so you can see on my books behind me, I wrote Enough Already. Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism and Provoked, about the Cold War with Russia and the war in Ukraine. And I have a brand new project coming out. You can see on my mic flag here. It's the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom. And we should be launching here, I don't know, within the month, I hope, at scotthortonacademy.com. And this is a major project like Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom, long form seminars by myself and other great experts on all different aspects of American foreign policy and freedom. And so that should be kicking off soon, and people can watch a great promo video and sign up with their email address there at scotthortonacademy.com.
I love it. All right, we're massively out of time, which breaks my heart because there was another story I wanted to cover with you. But hopefully you gentlemen will be willing to come back in the future. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for doing it.
Thanks, Hannah. Anytime.
All right, we're gonna take a brief break, and when we come back, Trita Parsi will be joining us to talk a little bit about what the future holds in Iran and whether the United States is gonna get dragged into a war with that country. So that and more coming up, don't miss it.
Our audience has given us everything, so we couldn't be more connected. When we first started, people would start giving us directions and say, okay, the mics are too large, move them. Turn them into lav mics. I mean, they were incredible. And then one guy walked in and gave us a really expensive switcher and said, you guys need this, and walked out. Okay, it's amazing. They helped us build a studio. They did a $2 million funding campaign for us. And so they really are us. We do this show together to the point where some of our hosts are even former listeners. So when we say that the audience is part of TYT, we really mean it.
I think what the audience also appreciates is especially if they're members, they really get an inside look into who we are, our personal lives, what drives and motivates us. It goes beyond just storytelling. I think that what we do is allow our viewers and our listeners into our daily lives, and we give them kind of like this inside look into everything that we're passionate about and why it is that we're doing what we're doing, right? Like the motivation behind what we're doing, I think is important for our audience to know, and we're not shy about sharing that with them. And it's different from what people typically see in legacy media outlets where everything is kind of dry and robotic and there's really no personality or authenticity that comes along with it. Oftentimes when we're doing the show, I don't really think of it as me telling them stories. I think of it as us having a mutual respect and conversation with one another. And as I said earlier, I mean, not only do I feel that through the work I do, I'm informing our audience, but they inform me oftentimes as well. You know, they'll pitch stories to us. They'll tell us, you know, a certain perspective or angle to a story that we might have missed, and I love it.
You're about to watch some behind the scenes footage of the Young Turks. Ooh. Now these are partial videos. If you want to get all of them, you become a member, go to tyt.com/join, and you'll get all the behind the scenes of me, Anna, John, JR, a little bit reality show like, tyt.com/join, and enjoy this.
You know what you're seeing behind me? Jersey, hold. Watch me flip this camera. However I flip it. Do I flip it like this? No, I just took a picture. I'm bitsing right now.
What?
Behind the scenes.
Oh, okay. For members? I don't have my face on.
She doesn't have her face on, folks. Oh, that's JR's ass right there.
You can't take 5 minutes off, can you?
No, I can't, Johnny. Bye. I said it was live stream, but I was lying. It's not a live stream. It's just for members. Bitsy, this is my cat. You know what his name is? Kiki Cat.
Animals are innocent.
Control room and the insanity is obviously there.
Right now, as you can see, I'm directing or tech directing.
I'm so happy to be here.
This is what like a Labor Day beard looks like for Jank. Man, you're a Young Turks viewer if you recognize me like this.
Oh, thank you. You are the one person in my life I would love to meet.
What's going on, guys? This is a Bitsy or a BTS or behind the scenes with Hassan Piker, aka Woke Bay.
Oh, hi, I didn't see you there.
I have finished my show, The Damage Report, and now I get into a really awkward time of the day.
When I'm sitting, the control room is right there. So I can see Bart.
This is the Pittsburgh office, by the way. Referred to often as the boiler room.
You see how it's ripped? Is it super unprofessional to wear that at a business meeting? Or am I like cool, rebel?
I just finished doing the power panel and I'm fired up.
What do you do for TYT?
Not a whole lot.
If you're frantically tweeting at us that something's broken, thank you, because I'm fixing it.
And thank you for being a TYT member.
Super last thing, because there's always got to be a super last thing. Oh, that was disastrous. This has been behind the scenes, behind the scenes.
Welcome back to the show. Anna Kasparian with you. Just want to read one comment before we move on. Face Scott Smith writes in and says, thank you guys for being so open-minded and welcoming. I love the fact that you are not biased and one-sided. I personally have opened my mind up quite a bit on a number of topics, but certainly when it comes to different voices weighing in on American foreign policy. And I've learned a lot from the anti-war libertarians like Scott Horton, like Dave Smith. I might not agree with them on other policies, certainly when it comes to, you know, public programs, public services, things like that. But when it comes to the issue of the US and its long time, relationship with Israel, unwavering support for Israel, and how detrimental that's been to the United States. I think it's important to work with like-minded people. And so I absolutely love it, and I hope you enjoyed the first hour. But the second hour is gonna be awesome as well. In fact, I wanna talk a little bit about Iran and Lebanon and what the future holds when it comes to US foreign policy in the Middle East. There are a lot of people who were critical of anti-war voices who did not want to bomb Iran on behalf of Israel. The concern was that the United States would get dragged into a long, hot war with Iran, and it would be a complete and utter disaster. Now they're essentially celebrating the fact that, look what happened. We bombed their nuclear sites. We haven't gotten into a hot war. All of these people were just fear-mongering about our relationship with Israel, what we were doing to these nuclear sites. Everything is totally okay. Except I don't think that the situation with Iran is over yet. And luckily, to speak about this, we have Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, Trita Parsi. Trita, it's been a long time since I've had you on the show, and I'm so happy you're here.
Likewise, good to see you again.
Good to see you. So I want to talk about Lebanon in just a moment, but let's focus on Iran for a second, because I am curious, what your analysis is in regard to our future with Iran, the likelihood that we might go back into Iran, because I certainly know the Israeli government is pushing for it.
Certainly, and I think an honest assessment of the situation and the war that Israel started on 13th of June is that it was an indecisive war. The Israelis, in my assessment, had three objectives, of which only one was achieved, and that was the objective of getting the US into that war. And that's the first time after more than 20 years of efforts that they managed to get the United States directly in a shooting war with the Iranians. But it didn't end up the way they wanted to, though, because they wanted the US to go in all in and take out as much of Iran's conventional forces as possible. Instead, what Trump did is that he did a one-off, a strike against the nuclear program, and then he ended it. I think it's fair to say that Trump likes or perhaps even loves military strikes, but is really very hesitant about going into a larger war. The two other objectives that they had, though, were failures. The second one was to decapitate the regime. And though they had some very significant intelligence successes in the first 24 hours of the war, the Iranians never lost full control of their command and control. And within 24 hours were shooting back at the Israelis, replaced a large number of senior military officials that the Israelis managed to assassinate together with their families, incidentally.
Yeah.
And the third and the most important objective, and it actually brings us into Lebanon as well, is that the larger objective of the Israelis is to reduce Iran into another Lebanon or Syria, a country that Israel can bomb at will with impunity, and very importantly, without US involvement. Clearly, that is not where the Israelis are with Iran right now. Without massive American support, the Israelis couldn't have done anything. But they were hoping to go much further, I suspect, in the first attack towards that goal than they did, to a large extent because of the effectiveness of Iran's missiles. But having started this campaign now, they cannot afford to end it until they have finished from their own standpoint. Because if they give the Iranians too much time, the Iranians will rebuild their air defense systems, perhaps buy better ones, root out the Mossad presence inside the country, et cetera, which then leads to a scenario in which I think the Israelis are bound, based on their own logic, to start this war relatively soon again. I would suspect that they will do so before December, because once you enter the midterm elections in the United States, it's not prohibitive, but it makes it a much more complicated matter for the Israelis, because they still need a tremendous amount of American support to do this.
But do they need a tremendous amount of American support? Because public polling in the United States has shown for many months now that the majority of Americans are not in favor of what Israel is up to. Now, there are some polls that, if you break it down based on, partisanship, there are more Republicans who are in favor of Israel as opposed to Democrats. But nonetheless, when you take the American population as a whole, polling and several different polls have indicated Americans want this to stop. And they're,
Oh, absolutely.
You're right.
There's no doubt about it. What I'm referring to is that they need America's military support to be able to do this. They cannot defend their own airspace without massive American support. I mean, for instance, take a look what happened in October of last year. That's when they had another shooting war between Israel and Iran. The Iranians managed to penetrate Israel's air defense system with some of their more medium quality missiles, to the point in which the Israelis begged the United States to put the THAAD battery system inside of Israel, which is the most advanced system the United States has. That they had that operating in the war in June, and it still was not sufficiently efficient to take down all the Iranian missiles. In fact, the Iranians managed to wreak a tremendous amount of havoc inside of Israel. So take the American aspect of it out, and the Israelis are in a much, much weaker position. So they still need a tremendous amount of American support. I think the Israelis do know quite well that they are losing the American public. And as a result, that just adds more impetus for them to do this as soon as possible before they have lost even more of the American support and before the political landscape in the United States changes to the point in which perhaps next time around, Trump actually will tell them no instead of telling them a half yes.
Okay, so I want to have a better understanding of Iran's actual military capability, because the fact of the matter is, it's become abundantly clear to me based on the restraint that's been demonstrated by the Iranians that they don't want to go to war. They don't want to go to war. But at the same time, I do question if it's because we have overestimated their military capability and they're actually much weaker than previously thought, or if it's because they just don't want to get engaged in a prolonged, military intervention. I know for a fact they weren't actually building nuclear weapons. I think that they wanted to present a latent, deterrent, enriching uranium up to 60%, but they didn't have any way of delivering a nuclear weapon if they planned on using it. I mean, they were still years away from actually having that capability. But, you hear a lot about, Iran is a real, it's a formidable foe militarily to the United States. I remember reading a lot of analysis about that, but it seems like they had a very muted response to what the United States did in bombing the nuclear sites, and also in regard to Israel's bombings, Israel's intention to start a war with Iran, and more importantly, Israel's been bombing Iran. I mean, Israel has been assassinating all sorts of people in Iran with impunity. So what's really going on with Iran? What is their military capability?
I think it's a great question. And I think to a large extent, it actually is a mixed picture, but it's also wrapped in a degree of strategic indecisiveness. You see, the Iranians took a tremendous amount of hits from the Israelis for a very long time without responding, or at least not responding particularly harshly. And that, again, goes to your first point. If they wanted a war, they had every opportunity for the last 5 years to start one or to accept one as the Israelis were striking their assets in Syria and other places. They didn't. And it was partly because they had a strategy that they call strategic patience. The time was on their side. They were going to build up their resources, their capabilities, strengthen these different groups that are allied with them, the Houthis, various groups inside of Iraq, Hezbollah, etc. And actually, if there is to be a confrontation, it would be at a point down the road when they're in a relatively stronger position. But the weakness of that strategy was that the Israelis understood that they, as a result, could actually take a lot of hits against the Iranians without the Iranians responding, precisely because they were playing the patient game. And over the course of several years, we saw how the Israeli attacks against Iran became increasingly bold and increasingly testing every red line the Iranians had presumably put in place, including attacks inside of Tehran, etc. And the one attack that they did that essentially changed the equation was when they struck the consular section of the Iranian embassy in Damascus. That's technically Iranian territory. Then the Iranian responded. But again, the response was one in which they showed what they could do, but without escalating further. And that was not in any way, shape, or form going to deter a country like Israel who wanted a war. If you want a war, then that clearly is not enough of a pushback against you. So we've seen how the Israelis have continued to escalate. Now, there's a lot of conversations in Iran about this strategic patience. Essentially, it has ended. But the question is what it's going to be replaced with. And there, the picture is mixed. The Iranians have a very weak air defense system, clearly. Their only deterrence is the effectiveness of their missiles. And in that area, they've actually proven themselves to be quite effective because they managed to go through all of the different layers of Israel's air defense system, including the American layers. But that doesn't mean that Iran can take all of these different hits or that they have a good answer to it. They don't have much of an air force. They don't have much of an air defense system. And on top of that, many of the different groups that they have been allied with, Hezbollah, etc., have taken massive hits from the Israelis over the course of the last 2 years.
So that brings me to Lebanon. There is a considerable amount of pressure being applied to the Lebanese government to essentially use their military to disarm Hezbollah at a time when Hezbollah has been weakened as a result of, Israel's military intervention, of course, aided and abetted by the United States. the threats range from we're going to cut you off from foreign aid to there's going to be military intervention, certainly with Israel going in. But at the same time, look, I'm just going to tell the truth and not pretend like this isn't the reality. Disarming Hezbollah is not going to bode well for the sovereignty of Lebanon. Especially when you have these far-right members of the Israeli government. I mean, the Likud party in their charter clearly believes in the Greater Israel Project. They want to annex more land from places like Lebanon. I don't think they even hide that. And so I'm not trying to defend a militant group per se, but I also know the threat to Lebanon's sovereignty if Hezbollah is effectively disarmed. Is my analysis correct here, or is there something I'm missing?
I think by and large is correct. I mean, on the one hand, Hezbollah wasn't sufficiently strong to deter Israel from attacking in the first place, but it was sufficiently strong to deter the Israelis from having a land invasion of Lebanon. They did wreak a tremendous amount of damage on Lebanon, particularly southern Lebanon. But going in with land troops deep into Lebanon, they learned their lesson from 2006 and they stayed away from that. You take away Hezbollah, then essentially Lebanon has no defense. This is partly Hezbollah's own fault, right? You created the state within the state and it actually made sure that the rest of the state is relatively weak. But it is also the fault of Western powers and the United States, who never wanted Lebanon to actually have a national military that could deter Israel. It should exist and be sufficiently strong to be able to take out Hezbollah, but never pose a challenge to Israel.
That's amazing. That's an incredible.
So the Lebanese are Lebanese are in a completely, tremendously unenviable position in the sense that some of them are very angry at Iran because of Iran's interference. But on the other hand, you have the Saudi, American, and other interference that is also trying to ensure that Lebanon is kept so weak that it will never pose a challenge to the Israelis. And one thing that is never asked in Western media is it always asks, how can Israel live in that neighborhood? Is a tough neighborhood. How are other countries in the region supposed to live next to a country that is currently committing a genocide, whose population and society by and large are in favor of that genocide? How are they supposed to have any safety living next to Israel? That is never asked. And that is at the very core of what Lebanon is dealing with right now. I can fully understand that there's a lot of Lebanese that are very, very angry at Iran because of Iran's dominant role in Lebanon. I'm surprised and at times confused why they don't feel the same anger when it comes to what Saudi Arabia has done or what the US currently is doing. The US is currently pushing effectively Lebanon into a new civil war. Rest assured, the Lebanese government wants to make sure that they disarm Hezbollah, but they want to do it in a manner that incorporates the Shia population and Hezbollah into the larger state of Lebanon, which means that at the end of the day, the state doesn't lose capacity. What the US seems to be pushing for right now is to essentially not disarm, but destroy Lebanon's capacity through Hezbollah to have any deterrence against Israel.
That's exactly
right. And that push is putting the Lebanese on the brink of a civil war. They've already suffered through that back in the 70s and 80s. And this is just an absolutely disastrous policy also from the US's own national interest. You see, in my view, the US's interest is to really reduce its military involvement and presence in the region. This region does not matter that much to the United States any longer. It is not a vital interest for the United States. The more we're playing these games, supporting Israel here or interfering in these different ways, the more we get entangled into the many, many different conflicts and problems that exist in the region. And the further away we are from all of the promises that not just Trump, but also Biden and others have made, which is that we should be starting to disentangle ourselves from the many conflicts in the region. Trump really made that a major promise. We're walking in the opposite direction, not only because of what's happening in Lebanon and the push for the disarmament in a way that will actually cause a civil war, but also with this ridiculous plan in Gaza, which in many ways is worse than what the US did in Iraq. Because in Iraq, as bad as that was, we didn't do any ethnic cleansing. We were not, moving 2 million people here and there or moving them around to create a different state, nor did we think that any project of democratization first started with the complete destruction of Iraqi society or the state. That's not the way that was done. And this is not a defense of the Iraq war, and anyone can look at my record, how critical I've been about that. But what is happening in Gaza now is in many ways worse and will deepen America's involvement and entanglement in the region that is exactly the opposite of what the Trump administration promised.
I mean, it's a stain on the United States that we are aiding and abetting a genocide. That I just, plain and simple. And so we have lost the moral high ground in the international community. You know, any claim of other countries engaging in human rights abuses or any criticism of even Vladimir Putin and the illegal war against the Ukrainians and their sovereignty. I mean, who are we to go around judging the actions of other countries when, again, we are aiding and abetting a genocide in Gaza? Trita Parsi, as always, you're brilliant. I appreciate the work you do. He's executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, and I hope you'll come back soon because I do appreciate your analysis.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right, we're gonna take a quick break. And when we come back, Ken Klippenstein joins us for the rest of the show. Everyone, welcome back to our social break. I'm gonna try to read as many comments as I can, starting with Ember of Hope, who says, I never get to watch Anna live because I can only watch on Fridays, so I'm stoked to be here. And I've been right there with you about feeling politically homeless and being blackpilled about taxes and why we continue to pay them. I've long believed that the only power the American people have left is our tax dollars, and only a mass boycott of our federal government from the inside and outside has the hope of moving our representatives on any significant issue relevant to the average American. We can't afford to wait and hope that we'll vote the right people in or out next year. I've brought this up both publicly on the show and privately to Cenk, the idea of just withholding our taxes, no taxation without representation. I don't really know how that would work. The only way that it would work is if we do mass organizing to ensure that everyone does this at the same time. Otherwise, if like a few people just withhold their taxes, like the IRS is gonna come a-knocking, okay? And you're not really gonna get anything accomplished. Look, organizing is the most important thing. Building coalitions is the most important thing. And being open-minded to people who might think differently on other issues really does matter when it comes to building those coalitions. And I'm trying to do my part in getting people to be a little more open-minded. I've gotten a lot of backlash for it, but I hope people who might still disagree with me on that understand that I'm coming from a good place because I want what's right for this country and for the people in this country. All right, let me move on to some other comments. I do a really bad job in reading as many comments as I can because I want to actually elaborate on what I think about your comments. Wang June says, Anna, Dave, and Scott together on a Friday show. This is too much power for one panel. Thank you for saying that. Nostra Science says it's 3 p.m. Pacific, TYT Live. And do you know where your secular democracy is? Well, check your milk carton for what it once looked like. Don't bother to call the authorities to report it missing. All right, let me read some super chats if we've got them. Coops writes in and says, we want to know what UK intelligence is passing on to the Israeli government. Yeah, that's the kind of collusion I wish any party in America cared about, but of course not. Anyway, let's get back to the show. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to TYT. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian. Joining us now is friend of the show and one of my favorite journalists, Ken Klippenstein, who you should subscribe to over at Substack. He's doing incredible work. Ken, how are you?
Hey, Anna, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime. I love your reporting over at Substack. Like, you were already an incredible journalist, but I feel like you're really finding your groove over at Substack because you're reporting on things other people refuse to report on. Whenever there's a manifesto, you are willing to publish it when other sources refuse to, which is weird. I don't know why they do that. But you've done some pretty good reporting as well on the effort to send troops to blue cities across this country. I think that it's Trump's latest effort in the kayfabe presidency, but I want to get your thoughts about it after I present this story. So let's get into it.
We're making a determination now. Do we go to Chicago? Or do we go to a place like New Orleans, where we have a great governor, Jeff Landry, who wants us to come in?
President Donald Trump has been threatening to send in National Guard troops to Chicago for some time, but on Wednesday of this week, he kind of changed his tune a little bit. He seemed to back off of the idea. Now, that same day, though, friend of the show, Ken Klippenstein, reported something that you should all read the entirety of over at Substack. It's titled Exclusive, Leak Confirms Chicago Military Action. Memo reveals Homeland crackdown has already begun. So Ken obtained a memo labeled for official use only that calls for the military to assist with upcoming ICE operations in Chicago, although it doesn't explicitly mention the Illinois National Guard. So Klippenstein writes that the document requests immediate Department of Defense support for ICE's enforcement and removal operations, ERO, activities to address public safety and national security. The request specifically seeks to support infrastructure, including highway access, fuel, and other logistical nodes. The memo goes on to cite several of President Trump's executive orders and declarations casting southern border immigration as an invasion and a national emergency, which, if you guys can remember, we covered this week. A conservative appeals court just declared that it's actually unlawful when Trump cites, an invasion and a national emergency in order to deploy federal troops or federal agents. Now, here's a direct quote from the memo. DHS seeks to expeditiously execute presidential guidance to protect the American people against invasion, foreign terrorists, and other national security and public safety threats. And Ken also writes, per an anonymous source, Customs and Border Patrol will also be looped into this, Chicago stunt or stint. The memo states that operations will last for 30 days and begin on September 2nd, which clearly that date has already come and gone. And that same day, the deputy director of public affairs for the Illinois National Guard spoke to Axios and said, no units have been activated and we do not have an order or preparatory command for any mission. Now, according to Ken Klippenstein, National Guard service members regard the mission as Trump theater and a stain on the mission and reputation of the military. It's not that they don't believe in responding to a crisis, they just don't see one. And that was pretty clear in what the National Guard troops were up to in places like LA and in some cases DC as well. Like, you see videos of them, Ken, like picking up trash, which is great. Like, I don't have a problem with them picking up trash, but that's not what they're supposed to do with their time. So I want to kind of get your thoughts on what's really going on here. You have Trump saying one thing publicly, but then privately, and through this memo, we're learning that there's already been some action taken in Chicago. So what's really going on here?
Yeah, I think key here is his use of the phrase repeatedly, national security. Trump and his administration are trying to turn immigration as an issue which is an issue and people are genuinely divided on if you look at the polling. And he's trying to elevate that to a national security issue. He's trying to turn it into essentially 9/11 and say, both publicly and behind the scenes to the intelligence community, which responds by giving him a menu of options to respond to these things, both public and secretly. He's going to them with the case that the migration through the southern border constitutes an invasion of the United States on the basis of the argument that they're bringing in drugs, and he points to fentanyl and the obviously horrific death count associated with that. But he's using that to say, well, what's the difference at this point if we have a body count similar to what you might have seen in Vietnam, for instance, and a formal war? And so I think it's that second step that hasn't really been openly discussed, debated. And I think if it was, people would have very different feelings about it than they do about immigration as an issue in itself. Because not only has he given, ICE is flush with cash now after the budget that they passed, a record budget, more than I think 2 or 3 times as much money as they previously had for what's called ERO, enforcement and removal operations. So they have all this cash. What do you need the military for? We just gave you this massive budget to finance federal law enforcement. So what is the purpose of the military? And one of the most striking parts of reporting on this is talking to the guardsmen, which nobody does in the press. I don't know if they're not high enough ranking. They like to talk to senior executives, but when you talk to them, it's not even political. They're just like, there's no reason for us here. This is a law enforcement matter. And that's a very basic constitutional question, as we saw in California, where it was deemed in violation of posse comitatus, not something you like to hear, the National Guard deployment to Los Angeles. That's what's at issue here. And it's really not a political question, at least when the guardsmen that I talked to, it's not primarily partisan. It's just saying, this isn't what we do. This is what we have federal law enforcement for. And they have a heck of a lot more money than they did a year ago.
Yeah, so what the hell is going on here, right? Because first of all, let me just say, I am very happy that you speak to members of the National Guard, and I'm even happier that many of them don't want to do this. They see this as a huge problem. They don't want to be deployed. In the case of Chicago, Trump changes the story, right? Like he'll talk about how, there's an invasion at the border, which kind of undercuts one of the things he's been successful in regard to the southern border, which is a lot less people are trying to cross the southern border right now under his administration. So then he'll kind of switch over to, it's the crime, I'm worried about the crime, and that's why I want to send in the National Guard. But that means that you're essentially pitting, troops against the American people. And in order to do that, I mean, you really need to have some extraordinary circumstances that would justify that. And luckily, even a conservative appeals court pushed back on Trump and shot down the idea that he could declare a national emergency to justify, sending in National Guard troops in response to so-called crime in some of these blue cities. And to your point about immigration, I do take the crime issue seriously, and there are a lot of Americans who are concerned about crime in some of these big cities. But I don't believe for a second that Trump is doing this because he wants to fight crime. I think that's the cover story. And then at the same time, you have all these resources pumped into Border Patrol, Customs, all of that. But Trump is also diverting local police in this theater that he's engaging in liberal cities. And so it's kind of hard to keep track of everything that's going on because he says different things at different times. He uses different excuses depending on the day of the week, who he's talking to. But I want to know if I'm getting something wrong here. When I refer to Trump's actions as more of the kayfabe presidency, am I right? Or is there really an issue in these cities like Chicago, that would justify sending in National Guard troops?
Well, I'm kind of of two minds in this view because, are the troops going to come out and just declare martial law and start arresting people? No, that's not what we're looking at here. But at the same time, the effect of having troops stationed, even if the troops don't support it and many of them think it's ridiculous, that is corrosive to liberal society and the view that the military shouldn't be involved in domestic civil affairs unless there is, like you said, an extraordinary reason, an emergency for them to be able to respond to that. Just acculturating people to think it's acceptable for this to be like the Egyptian junta just marching around. That's also not good. So I don't take the sort of maximalist warning that the coup is coming and all this business, but it's still not good. And so I take a sort of third position, which is this is harmful to democratic culture, should be opposed on those grounds, even if they're just sitting around and picking up trash, as you point out, which is absolutely true. And I was talking to one service member who said, I will desert if they tell me to use my weapon on fellow citizens.
Oh, I love that.
And I think that's I think that's probably a pretty common view. So I don't want to be hysterical about it. And if you are, that's exactly what Trump wants, because then he can say, oh, look how reasonable I am and these crazies responding to me. But I do want to say that there's, grounds to look at this stuff and say we shouldn't have guys marching around that are the military, even if what they're doing is innocuous. So it's both theater and it's dangerous, I think.
I totally agree with you. And again, please check out Ken's reporting over at Substack because he doesn't get hysterical. He does good reporting. And I think you're right. Trump really thrives when the left freaks out over him. He wants to trigger you. He wants to see a rise out of the left. That doesn't mean you shouldn't take what he's doing seriously or as a threat, but you got to be a little more strategic and tactical in how you respond to Trump, because it also kind of rallies more support among his base when the libs are getting owned or whatever, you know what I'm saying? So I kind of learned from that in his first term, and I try to be as level-headed in responding to what he's doing as possible. So, all right, I want to move on to H Block, guys, if you don't mind, because I really want to get your thoughts, Ken, on this whole Taylor Lorenz, dark money Democratic group, paying content creators and influencing their content, having editorial control over their content, which I do find to be a huge problem. You've been commenting about it online and getting pushback from members of the left who have called me a grifter, which is interesting. But before we get to all of that, let me just present the story.
Some creators in the first 48 hours took the Wired story and expanded it with even more outrageous claims, suggesting that it's AIPAC or IPAC. I don't even know how it's pronounced, IPAC, that is funding this show or other creators. Of course, not true. That the DNC is involved, not true.
That was David Pakman. David Pakman is a longtime left-wing content creator, and he knows what AIPAC is. Let me just get that out of the way. But he put out a video essentially defending himself after Taylor Lorenz, reporting for Wired, had uncovered the fact that there was a dark money Democratic group essentially influencing left-wing influencers by paying them as much as $8,000 a month in order to, continue doing the content they're doing, but it's important to note that this group would also have some editorial control. So I'm not necessarily against content creators getting the bag, but I am against, various dark money groups having editorial control. And I want to be clear, we've had sponsors at TYT, we've had certain, advertising deals, whatever. Ain't nobody telling me what I'm gonna say on this show. I'm gonna say whatever the hell I want. And that's the important thing that matters here, right? So let me get to the details of the story itself. So this dark money group has been bankrolling left-wing influencers to toe the Democratic Party line specifically, while being advised to avoid disclosing that they were getting paid to do so. That's the other problem, like the fact that you're not revealing to your audience, disclosing the fact that you are being funded by this group. And so we'll give you some more of the creators, because it wasn't just David Pakman, of course, in just a minute. So the so-called nonprofit that was paying these influencers is called Chorus. They were being offered $8,000 per month to take part in a secretive program aimed at bolstering democratic messaging on the internet. So the Chorus Creator Incubator Program is funded by a powerful liberal dark money group called the 1630 Fund. More than 90 influencers took part in this, and among them were Olivia Juliana, the centrist Gen Z influencer who spoke at the 2024 Democratic National Convention, at a time when a Palestinian surrogate for Kamala Harris wasn't allowed to speak because she happened to be Palestinian and they were terrified about that. You have Lauren Peretra, a former Playboy executive turned political influencer who hosts a podcast for Occupy Democrats. Suzanne Lambert, who has called herself a Regina George liberal. Ariel Fodor, who's an education creator with 1.4 million followers on TikTok. Sandra Jennings, a former TLC reality star and older brother of trans influencer Jazz Jennings. David Pakman, of course, and Lee McGowan, who goes by the online moniker Politics Girl, and dozens of others. Literally 90 people were involved in this. So the deal came with some strings attached, including one that I would never in a million years agree to. The creators who joined the incubator are expected to attend regular advocacy trainings and daily messaging check-ins. The idea that you could pay me to do more meetings, like not in a million years, okay? Those messaging check-ins are led by Cohen on rapid response days. The creators also have to attend at least 2 Chorus newsroom events per month, which are events Chorus plans, often with lawmakers. It mandated extensive secrecy about disclosing their payments and had restrictions on what sort of political content the creators could produce. And the dark money group also wanted editorial control, and that's really like part of the issue here, okay? So according to copies of the contract with which Taylor Lorenz obtained, okay, she's got the receipts, that's important here. Creators in the program must funnel all bookings with lawmakers and political leaders through Chorus. Creators also have to loop Chorus in on any independently organized engagements with government officials or political leaders. One creator who asked not to be named told Wired the following: "If I want to work with another politician, I have to fully collaborate with them. If I get, meaning with Chorus, if I get Zoran Mamdani and he wants to do an interview with me, I don't want to give them that." And they weren't allowed to disclose that they were being funded. The contract stipulated that they'd be kicked out and essentially cut off financially if they even so much as acknowledged that they were part of the program. Some creators also raised concerns about a slew of restrictive clauses in the contract. So I could go on and on. Please read the original reporting by Taylor Lorenz. Whatever you might think about her, put that aside. She did a really good job in uncovering what was going on with this dark money liberal group and the influence they had over content creators, and the fact that it wasn't even being disclosed to audiences. So Ken, our audience might not know about your thoughts on this. You've been vocal about it on X and other platforms, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the major issue here is the lack of transparency around the money. If you want to be a flack, it's a free country, that's fine. If you really believe in the Democratic Party or whatever party, go out there, voice your concerns, work for them, that's all fine. It's the lack of having a label on the food that tells people what the nutritional value is. Because if people want to eat junk food, that's fine, but they should be able to know or find out how that is. And that's the real problem here. I don't care about the creators. I'm not gonna profess to know what their intentions are. Some of them are pretty young. I'm guessing some of them maybe didn't realize some of the stuff I'm talking about here. I'm concerned about the public and the news consumers who are watching this stuff, not realizing that they're getting paid by this group that is aligned with the Democratic Party on a number of different issues. I've been paying very close attention to the Democratic Party, particularly leadership since Trump's re-election, to get a sense of how they're trying to push back, what their own messaging is. And one of the things I was most surprised by was not just the lack of very much of it, but to the extent that there were these interviews, it was with all of these AstroTurf groups that at the time I didn't really realize. I mean, you can sort of tell by watching it. Like, it's like the old Simpsons joke. Sir, what do you have to say about your campaign has the momentum of a runaway freight train? That's kind of the vibe of a lot of these AstroTurf shows. And so after reading this story, I'm not saying that they're getting money from this group in particular, but there's clearly some kind of a relationship. And so Schumer and Jeffries are happy to go on. You could go on YouTube now and find these shows with kind of fake questions, never have a difficult question. And the people that are hurt by that is anybody that happens to see that and thinks, oh, this looks like a pod, it has the microphone set up. It's kind of high def and looks fancy. Maybe I don't think ordinary people have the media literacy or time to figure out, oh, this is actually paid programming. So to me, that's the major issue here. And not just that, when the Democratic Party ends up talking to itself in an echo chamber of someone who they paid essentially, maybe not directly from the party, but from a group that's aligned with the party to softball these questions, that's how you end up getting Hakeem Jeffries having to actually go and give a press conference and looking like, wait, you're going to ask me these questions about Mamdani? This is what I'm used to. They've had no practice in a hostile. I mean, you go on interviews where you strongly disagree with people, and that helps to strengthen your arguments,
right?
And makes you it helps you to make a better case for things. So not only is it bad for the public, I think it's bad for the party too.
100%.
So I don't understand why it's tolerated.
Yes, 100%. Because rather than understanding like why they lost the last presidential election, what they could do differently, how they can be a stronger party that represents the average Democratic voter, they're essentially manufacturing like like supportive insulation, like to insulate them from, bad negative coverage about what they're up to. And Hakeem Jeffries is a complete and utter disaster for the Democratic Party. He's trying to be, if the Democrats manage to get a majority in the House, he'd be the Speaker of the House. Has anyone seen him in an interview? He's like the least charismatic politician I have ever seen in my life. And it's mind-boggling to me.
It's some of the most predictable questions. They don't have a line for it yet. It's like, dude, you didn't game this out that someone's gonna be curious about your view on Mamdani or your view on Gaza or whatever it is. That's really troubling that they clearly haven't considered they must be in a bubble where, it's all these paid guys. And in my experience, they end up thinking, well, this is really how the world is because they don't have any experience outside of it. I mean, DC is already such a bubble.
Definitely. So I want to go to some of the, some of the content creators who were named in the piece and how they've been kind of like at least attempting to defend themselves. For instance, Olivia Juliana stated that the basic premise of the report is false. Here she is claiming that Chorus had no control over her work whatsoever, even though she signed a contract that claimed that Chorus is going to have editorial control over her work. Let's take a look.
We are not paid to make content. We are not paid by the Democratic Party. Chorus does not have any creative control over any of the content that I make, over any of the people that I talk to, and they have never and will never tell me what I can or cannot say. The contract that we sign does not pay us for content. It is the same as somebody giving seed money to a small business to build their infrastructure so that that business can go on to be self-sustaining in the future. I have absolutely no shame about being part of Chorus. I am someone who has been on my own, working and busting my ass since I was 19 years old to be able to build a better life for my children and give them the safety and security I never had. And next year, when I go back to college and I'm able to finish and become the first person in my family to graduate from college, I will have absolutely no guilt in accepting money to make myself more independent in the future.
I want to go to graphic 8 here. It's an excerpt from Taylor Lorenz's reporting. And again, she has the receipt, she has the contract, okay, that these creators signed. And part of it, this is what it stipulates. They also forbid creators from disclosing the identity of any funder and give Chorus the ability to force creators to remove or correct content based solely on the organization's discretion if that content was made at a Chorus organized event. That sounds like editorial control to me, but I could be mistaken. What are your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, I'm actually more concerned about the soft forms of influence that exist. That, in complete candor, when I was younger, I didn't fully understand because you don't quite understand how power flows and why people are motivated to do certain things. And just, I lived in Washington for several years, which is where many of these creators are, North Virginia, that kind of area. And when you're getting checks from a group and you're socializing with other creators in that group and everyone is in that world, it's the influence that I see exercise over people isn't often overt, where it's like, well, on page 12, I agree to this. It's more, well, everybody else is doing this, so this must be how it's done. And so, and the way in which a lot of the creators mentioned are pretty young and probably pretty green behind the ears and probably still learning how things work. If you can keep their world contained in this little bubble of other creators like that, you could give the impression that doing stuff that I think from the outside a lot of people would see as icky. You give them the sense that, well, this is how it's done. This is how things work. And there's a lot of justifications given for that. Oh, we're facing this unprecedented fascist takeover, so unprecedented measures have to be taken. That's one of the most common responses I've gotten when I've just posted on social about this stuff is, well, they're up against this unprecedented enemy, so therefore we have to be as ruthless as they are. And that's completely true, that there are right-wing groups, including ones that are taken from foreign governments. So there's no question that the same is happening on the right, and in some cases worse, at least than we know. But to me, do you want to participate in this race to the bottom where everyone is worse off because you've decided that this is what must be done because the other side is doing it?
To me, this is not being ruthless, okay? To me, and to your point earlier, this weakens the Democratic Party because the power players aren't interested in constructive criticism. They're not interested in improving. They're not interested in doing what's necessary to appeal to voters. Certainly, independent voters that they lost, even some Democratic voters that they lost in the last election, they switched sides and voted for Trump. They need to try to figure out why that is and what they can do to improve. And instead, they're doubling down and wrapping themselves in bubble wrap by essentially shelling out a ton of money to content creators to give people the illusion that there's popularity with the Democratic Party. There isn't. All right, Ken, thank you again for joining us. You're amazing. Everyone, please check out his reporting over at Substack. Is there anything else you'd like to promote before we go?
Oh yeah, and I'm always on Twitter, particularly if you're National Guard. I'm really interested in chatting with you, so shoot me a message.
I love it. Thank you so much, Ken, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
All right, everyone, that does it for today's show. I really hope you enjoyed it. When we come back for our members specifically, Kate Bettino will be joining us, and we've got some fun stories to share with you, which I'm looking forward to. So stick around for that. If you're not a member, tyt.com/join. We'll see you there.